The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
All right, we are 6 days away from the first primary in the state of Iowa. Kind of a primary. It's a caucus. People show up, they have a meeting, they sit at tables, and Iowa voters got the last chance to look at the Democratic candidates last night. There was a sort of debate. It wasn't really a debate. It was a town hall forum. Each of the three Democratic candidates, Bernie Sanders, Martin O'Malley, and Hillary Clinton, in that order, answering questions from Chris Cuomo of CNN and from the audience. Everybody did fantastic, Lewis. I mean, you have soft opposition. You're basically allowed to just talk. You're going to look pretty good as long as you have a plan. But there are some pretty interesting things here. Segment producer Noah Ferguson pulled some of the clips for us. Let's start first with Bernie Sanders. This was interesting. Bernie Sanders asked, in spite of Hillary Clinton potentially being the first female president, how would you be as good or better for women than would Hillary Clinton?
Alexis, second aspect to your question, though, right? You said then the first female president. How do you think that you would be as helpful to women as a woman president would? Yeah. What about that aspect? That's what Hillary Clinton represents on one level to voters, that she would be the first female president. And there is something special in that, especially when it comes to women's issues.
And of course, I understand that. But I think if you look at my record in terms of fighting for women's rights, I think there are very few members of Congress who have a stronger record. It's 100% lifetime, and I've been there for a while. In addition to that, there have, as you know, women are making 79 cents on the dollar compared to men. That is nothing but old-fashioned sexism, and I am a strong advocate and will fight for pay equity for women. I believe that, and it's not only women, although it impacts women, it impacts women of color even greater. This level of pay inequity is extraordinary.
All right, so let's stop it there. So the good, Bernie Sanders making the point that, hey, identity politics alone don't make you good or bad on a particular issue. Certainly they may make you sensitive to a particular issue in a way that you could not otherwise be. But if you look at my voting record is fantastic. And then he went on to sort of draw on the general themes of his campaign: pay, income inequality that is non-gender inequality, et cetera. The problem I have, Lewis, he said 79 cents for every dollar a man earns. That number is just not right. And we're extensively researching that. We're going to have a long form piece about the gender pay gap. There is a gender pay gap. It is not 77 or 79 cents per dollar. So that was disappointing that Bernie Sanders used that, although many politicians continue to use it. They may not even know that that's not the right number at this point.
It's not the right number, but there is this inequality.
Yes,
right?
There is.
There is a pay gap. In some sectors, it's bigger than others.
Absolutely.
I think there is a lot of misinformation on that topic.
Let's next go to Chris Cuomo asking Bernie Sanders about his shift, known to some as a flip-flop, on manufacturer liability and gun store liability when guns are used to commit crimes. This has just come up again and again. Here's Bernie finally taking it head on.
Criminals.
Senator, address your shift on the issue regarding manufacturers and their liability. Just to remind you guys, tell them where you were first and then what you just said recently.
I voted for the bill. And the reason I voted for the bill is you got a bill which has a number of elements in it. Among other things, it has a section which says we should not be selling ammunition which will pierce policemen's armor and protection. I think that's the right thing. It had a section in it which said that we want to have safety locks for children on guns. That makes sense to me. It also had a provision in it which says the following, and people may disagree with me, this is my view, is that if you are a small gun shop in Vermont and I legally sell you a weapon, okay, you go out, buy that gun legally, and then you go out and kill somebody. I think the gun shop owner should not be held liable for your criminal act.
All right, let's stop it there. I agree with Bernie Sanders on this. I am bashed day in and day out, Lewis, for being a gun-grabbing, crying liberal, sissy on guns, or whatever it is people call me. I am in favor of all sorts of gun safety regulations, but if a small business sells a gun that they are legally allowed to sell, does the background check, does everything they need to do to legally sell that gun. The small business gun store should not be held liable if someone ultimately commits a crime with that gun. That's just common sense to me. I'm glad he cleared it up, and I hope people understand what it is that Bernie Sanders is saying.
I think some people that are way more liberal than you might say that that's not good enough. They like to point the finger everywhere. It is common sense. I agree. Unless unless the gun store is breaking the law,
right,
it does not make sense that they should be held liable for anyone else's crimes of any sort.
And then Bernie Sanders' closing statement here.
You got 30 seconds. Tell the voters of Iowa what you want them to know.
Look, Hillary Clinton is a very good person. Martin O'Malley is a very decent guy. So I'm not, this is not a personal stuff. It just seems to me that the crises that we face as a country today, and we didn't even get into climate change to a significant degree, inequality, poverty in America, an obscene and unfair campaign finance system. These problems are so serious that we have got to go beyond establishment politics and establishment economics. In my view, we need a political revolution where millions of people stand up and say, you know what, that great government of ours belongs to all of us, not just the few. That's why I'm running for president. Thank you.
All right, so Bernie Sanders continuing to drive this main theme home. Inequality is not good. Corporations have taken over, and the average person is just not getting a fair shake. On comes Hillary Clinton, former Secretary of State, asked about being new to the issue of income inequality, an issue that has been Bernie Sanders' bread and butter. Hillary Clinton asked a question saying, you're sort of new to this issue. What about that? And here is Hillary Clinton's answer, and I think there's something very interesting in this.
Great. Secretary Clinton, earlier this month, Vice President Joe Biden said you are a newcomer to the issue of income inequality, while praising Senator Sanders for his authentic voice on the issue. How do we know that you will keep this issue a top priority?
Well, I have the greatest respect for the Vice President, but I think it's fair to say that I have a 40-year record of going after inequality. And not only economic inequality, racial inequality, sexist inequality, homophobic inequality, the kinds of things that go after people to put them down and push them back.
Let's stop the clip. So I agree. Hillary Clinton for a long time has been fighting for the rights of the little guy in many ways. But Hillary Clinton was in favor of defining a marriage as between one man and one woman as recently as a few years ago, right? So yes. I think it's odd, Lewis, that she includes as her lifelong battle fighting against homophobic inequality. She was the one saying we need to keep marriage between one man and one woman less than a decade ago.
All right. I guess you could get into the minutia of that. She might say, well, I was in favor of something else, maybe not marriage.
With all the same rights.
Unions, rights, whatever. But as far as I'm concerned, and it sounds like as far as you're concerned, it was a flip-flop.
Whether it was a flip-flop or not, the main issue I have is what record of 40 years of fighting against homophobic inequality. I don't think the data back that up whatsoever. And then lastly, Hillary Clinton asked about the email scandal, and then it was a very interesting exchange she had with Chris Cuomo about it.
President.
On that issue, the Des Moines Register, as we said earlier, gave you an endorsement. They did question your judgment, though, when it came to the email issue. They said, and you know this, but for the audience, in 2008, quote, when she makes a mistake, she should just say so. This weekend, they said, that's a lesson that you have not learned. Yes, you apologized, but only when you needed to, not when you first could have. Fair criticism?
Well, I think that look, I was delighted to get the Register's endorsement, and it was a very generous one. And yes, I think that's a fair criticism. You know, I had no intention of doing anything other than having a convenient way of communicating, and it turned out not to be so convenient. So again, we've answered every question, and we will continue to do so. But maybe being faster, trying to scramble around to find out what all of this means, I probably should have done that quicker.
You're willing to say it was an error in judgment? You should have apologized?
No, I'm not willing to say it was an error in judgment, because nothing that I did was wrong. It was not It was not in any way prohibited. And
Not apologizing sooner, I mean.
Well, apologizing sooner, as soon as you can. But part of the problem, and
All right,
I
so
would
we
just
see
say
where
that
this is going. Asked about that, no, she will not admit it was an error in judgment. This is really a non-story for me, and I think that that's it. And we will see if she is the nominee, if it continues to be an issue against the eventual Republican nominee. I believe that it will be. We have 6 days until Iowa, essentially tied Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. Lewis, we will have data very soon, actual voting data.
I can't wait. And I think you were right. If she is the nominee, we might even see an indictment here based on the email stuff. It looks like there might be one looming, right?
I don't know. I don't know the answer. I know there are people who want there to be one.
There is an FBI investigation.
There is an investigation going on, and we will continue to follow that. There is talk of a possible Michael Bloomberg presidential run. Bloomberg, of course, the former mayor of New York City, both a favorite and enemy of some Democrats and some Republicans. A source close to Bloomberg says he's not only looking to run if Hillary Clinton is not the nominee, but that he may be looking to run regardless of who is the Democratic nominee. This would be a third-party candidacy. Donald Trump says, I would love to have Michael Bloomberg get in the race, but I don't know if he's going to, but I hope he does. I'd love to run against him. Bernie Sanders said, another multi-billionaire running for president? I don't think that that's what we need. And indeed, sources close to Bloomberg are saying, Lewis, that he may be willing to spend $1 billion of his own money running for president. Interesting candidate because he was a Democrat most of his life until he ran for elected office, became a Republican, eventually left the Republican Party and was elected again as New York City mayor under the independent party. In other words, not under a party. And the most interesting question, just 6 days from the first primary, is how would Michael Bloomberg affect the polls? We have a couple of scenarios here from a poll taken just before he said he might be doing this. In an imaginary three-way race between Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, and Michael Bloomberg, okay? Sanders 35, Trump 34, Bloomberg 12, and 19 don't know. Bloomberg getting more support from Democrats than from Republicans in this hypothetical matchup, meaning he would hurt the Democratic nominee more than he would hurt the Republican nominee. Looking at a possible Clinton-Trump-Bloomberg three-way race, you see that it would be Trump 37, Clinton 36, Bloomberg 13, within the margin of error, but maybe slightly better for the Democratic candidate if Michael Bloomberg were to get in, assuming Donald Trump is the Republican nominee. Democrats, in that case, supporting Bloomberg at the exact same rate as Republicans. So we will continue to follow this. It would be, this could be a spoiler candidacy, but it's not clear for who, Lewis. We will continue to follow it and see if he ultimately does get in the race. There is a new Republican poll which suggests Donald Trump is just absolutely dominating. This is a CNN ORC poll, which says 41% of Republican voters nationwide say they now back the billionaire Donald Trump. Trump has topped the 40% mark for the first time in this particular poll. The CNN ORC poll, 41% for Trump, 19% for Ted Cruz. What do you think, Lewis? I mean, Trump is coalescing a really big part of the Republican electorate.
Well, Cruz has been getting more media attention, and I guess for him that's a bad thing,
right?
Because it doesn't seem to be working. And that kind of makes sense to me. I mean, he's not very charismatic. I certainly don't like anything he has to say. I mean, I understand why people are getting excited, or at least compromising for Donald Trump.
Yeah. People who are compromising for a guy whose political positions before 6 months ago were basically the exact opposite of anything they would normally seek in a Republican elected official. Remember that in an average of recent polls, Trump is at about 36%. The 41% poll is an outlier, but it's not that far from the average. And remember, final reminder on this, the person who was ahead at this point in the race a week before Iowa often did not end up being the nominee. Let's just all remember that and wait to see what happens next Monday. I'm on Twitter at dpacman. Lewis is on Twitter at lewismotamedy.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Jennifer Lavoie. Jennifer signed up at davidpakman.com/membership. And I will remind everybody, tonight, 8 p.m. Eastern, we have our David Pakman Show members-only town hall video conference where we will join our subscribers, Lewis, for an hour of just answering their questions. All members, including Jennifer, will be invited. You can sign up at davidpakman.com/membership. And remember that in 1 week, on February 2nd, on the day of my 32nd birthday, Lewis, we will be having a fantastic membership discount related to me turning 32 years old. If you want to be notified about that, make sure you are on our mailing list, which of course you can sign up for at davidpakman.com on the left side of the page. Here's something pretty interesting. Does Hillary Clinton use laughter as a way of diffusing or avoiding topics she's not that interested in discussing? The first example I will play for you is from last night's town hall in Iowa, where Hillary Clinton was asked, how did you end up running against a socialist named Bernie? And she laughed. Take a look at this.
2008, we're talking about. Here you are again, another election. Praise and promise coming your way, but another nail-biter
Right.
with a self-described socialist named Bernie.
Right.
How did that happen?
Look, it's a great country, despite what
Yeah.
other.
So laughing, all right, maybe not an issue she's that desperate to avoid, but she's probably also wondering how this socialist named Bernie is doing so well against her. So then she was asked, hey, Hillary, will you release the transcript from your paid speeches at Goldman Sachs? You know, you say one thing about Wall Street, but you get all this money from making speeches for Goldman Sachs. We'd like to know what those speeches said. Here was Hillary Clinton's reaction to that question.
Sorry.
I'm so happy you're part of
Hi, Secretary Clinton. Will you release a transcript of your paid speeches to Goldman Sachs? No, there's a lot of controversy over the speeches.
All right, so laughing that one off, and that is definitely now getting in to be a topic that she is not interested in having much of a conversation about. And then here's Hillary Clinton laughing on questions about her ongoing email situation, which we've discussed.
I know Bernie Sanders said that, quote, the American people are sick and tired of hearing about your damn emails. But there are a lot of people who are not.
Well,
including FBI officials looking into whether national
Okay,
security
stop it there. The FBI, that's a good one. And then just a few days ago, Hillary Clinton also laughed off Chris Christie's suggestion that she could be prosecuted for her use of private email servers during her tenure as Secretary of State. So is this nervous laughter? I think it actually is not a bad technique, Lewis, because if you see Hillary Clinton laughing, that might be, if that's a turnoff, if you really react to that, you're probably already somewhat skeptical of Hillary Clinton. And if you're someone who is sort of in the middle or a supporter of Hillary Clinton's, seeing her laugh these issues off probably reinforces your idea that they're just sort of going after her in a witch hunt sort of mentality. I don't think this is a bad strategy for her, although increasingly people are writing articles saying, what's up with Hillary laughing these off?
I think it's a bad strategy. It's a bad strategy for me. Maybe I think differently from the majority of the populace.
But what you're actually confirming what I'm saying. You already are not thrilled with much of what Hillary's doing. So yeah, you don't like it, but it's not really changing your view of Hillary. You'd rather Bernie, but you'd vote for her over the Republicans. So her laughing is not having a practical effect on you.
Well, I like to think that I'm thinking about it pragmatically and practically. And I'm thinking to myself that if she were good enough to actually come up with a really solid defense, and if she were competent enough to easily dismiss whatever is being asked of her, however ridiculous it may be,
based on the facts,
she wouldn't have to laugh, right?
Interesting. So you see the laugh as something she's choosing to do instead of really destroying whatever argument is being put to her.
Maybe she thinks it's easier. Maybe her campaign advisors told her that this is a good strategy.
Yeah, but think about it, though. If you're shaking hands after an event and someone says, Secretary Clinton, will you release the transcripts from your speeches to Goldman Sachs? Are you really going to say, well, listen, those are private speeches and there's actually no reason, blah, blah, blah. How can you, I don't understand how you can win when you're going through the handshake line. So maybe the laughing it off is logical.
Well, I think she could just as easily look to the camera and say, I have no reason to do that. Or that's not something I need to do, or even just say, that's not important. I think there are any number of compelling things she could say to dismiss that. Instead, it just kind of comes off in a strange way when she just laughs and ignores the person asking the question.
All right, Lewis doesn't like it. I think that while it's not exactly what makes the best impression, I don't know that it will really hurt her if you think about who will react in which particular way. Send me your thoughts on what you think about the Hillary laughter thing. Speaking of laughing, CBS host Bob Schieffer, he was unable to contain a giggle fit during his interview with Republican Senator and presidential candidate Ted Cruz. Remember when Republicans shut down the government and Ted Cruz absolutely loved it? Ted Cruz went on CBS with Bob Schieffer and said it was Obama who shut down the government, acting like he had nothing to do with it. And Bob Schieffer understandably could not contain a giggle fit. Take a look at this. Not this one, though. Not this one. This is from the Democratic debate last night. We have the Ted Cruz clip on with Bob Schieffer. Let's review. Nope, that's not it either. I know you've got it in there somewhere, Lewis. We'll pick it up with Bob Schieffer.
I do have
asking
it in there.
for a second time.
Here we go.
You're not taking responsibility for this? Nope, now we have just audio of the debate.
Okay, well, something is going on with this computer, Dave.
I know we have it, Lewis.
You're just going to have to talk while I try and get this figured out.
All right, so to set it up more extensively, Bob Schieffer asked Ted Cruz once, what about your responsibility in shutting down the government? And Ted Cruz said, oh, no, you don't remember right. I mean, Democrats said we shut down the government, but it was really Democrats and Obama that actually shut down the government. So then Bob Schieffer asks again, wait a second, you're still denying responsibility. And Lewis, Ted Cruz said,
all right, let me go back to one thing. And the question I asked you was, would you ever conceive of threatening to shut down the government again?
Well, as I said, I didn't threaten to shut down the government the last time. I don't think we should ever shut down the government. I repeatedly voted to fund the federal government.
Senator, if you didn't threaten to shut down the government, who was it that did? I mean, but we'll go on to something else.
It was Harry Reid and President Obama. But Bob, look, I understand that the White House said over and over again the shutdown is the Republicans' fault, and I understand that's what you're repeating. But the reality is, I voted over and over again to fund the federal government.
All right, let's stop it there. Bob Schieffer is right to laugh. I mean, this is just absolute. I know they told you. They said we. Do we have? Yeah. This is crazy, right? I mean, fortunately, Republicans like Ted Cruz have not been able, Lewis, to confuse or trick Americans. Most Americans understand the shutdown was the fault of Republicans. And Ted Cruz trying to do the slime the media thing, saying, hey, Democrats have been saying we shut down the government, so I understand you're repeating that, right? Trying to attack Bob Schieffer. This is not even controversial. There's tons of controversies in this country that shouldn't be. Planned Parenthood, Benghazi, etc. This is fortunately not a controversy because Americans know that Republicans shut down the government, and this is laughable.
Well, don't be so sure. We tend to have short memories.
You think?
And I think we know it was a disaster. We know that Boehner said it was a disaster. We know that Obama had absolutely nothing to do with the shutdown.
Right.
But, you know, if you go back and you start saying it was the Democrats' fault, it was Obama's fault, Obama wouldn't compromise. Obama,
say it enough.
If you say it enough, it kind of becomes true. We don't hear much of this, but...
No, we don't hear much of it because the Republicans didn't do it again because it backfired so drastically. Send me your thoughts on this. Am I missing something in Ted Cruz's explanation? We're on Facebook.com/David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Professor C Grayling, Professor of Philosophy and Master of New College of the Humanities in London. It's so great to have you on. So many people have recommended that we speak to you, and I think a good sort of general place to start would be, you've talked about ethics and morality and religion and humanism. Question one for those who may be uninitiated in the topic. Are humanism and atheism connected? Are they overlapping? Are they different but similar in some way? Let's start there for our audience.
Yes, indeed. I mean, it is important, in fact, to distinguish not merely atheism and humanism, but also secularism, because these are three rather different things. Atheism is a debate between people who have a religious conviction of some kind, the theists, and those who don't, the atheists. And that's ultimately a metaphysical debate about what there is in the universe, what exists or doesn't exist, in particular whether there are any transcendent agencies of some kind. Secularist debate, of course, is about the place of the religious voice in the public square and how much influence it has on public policy matters. And in that respect, a religious person could very well be a secularist, because a religious person could think that church and state matters ought to be kept apart. Humanism is an ethical outlook, and it is very naturally the ethical outlook that a non-religious person might hold. Because, of course, if you have a religious commitment of some kind, it's quite likely that you think that your moral outlook, your behavior, your relationships with others should be governed by what a deity says or desires, requires of you. Whereas the humanist, having no religious outlook, will say it's our responsibility to think very seriously and carefully about how we're to live our lives, what kind of people we're to be. That's the great Socratic challenge, and also how, very importantly, we're to relate to others. So there is a natural connection between atheism and humanism, but it is possible for non-atheists, let us say, agnostics perhaps, or even people who have a very liberal view of religion, perhaps a kind of deistic residual religion, to think that their ethical reflections ought to be premised on concerns about what it is to be human.
I'd love to get a little bit into the discussion around ethics and what is ethical. And in many of my conversations with those who say they are devoutly religious, one of their main sort of, when you ask them why is religion needed in their mind, they say, well, religion gives us a moral and ethical code. And without a moral and ethical code presented by religion, any analysis that we make about what actions are or are not ethical would be sort of arbitrary in a sense. Now, for example, Sam Harris in his book, The Moral Landscape, he says, no, actually, science can tell us what is good or bad. We can make objective determinations about increasing well-being versus decreasing it, and we can get a sort of ethical code as to what is good or bad from science. I'd be curious where you fit into this debate.
Well, let me say first that it's very important to distinguish ethics and morality. I mean, people who use the conjunction ethics and morality think that they're speaking about the same thing, but actually they're wiser than they know. The idea of ethics comes from an ancient Greek concept of ethos, which means character. And so when we have thoughts about ethical lives, we're thinking about that question I mentioned earlier. What sort of people should we be? How should we live? What values should shape and color our attitude towards life? Morality is a much narrower thing. It concerns the question of our responsibilities towards one another. And moral outlooks change over time. Rather like a pendulum swinging backwards and forwards, you get more and less liberal attitudes, more and less puritanical attitudes. But ethical reflection can very often does modify and enrich our moral understanding. So, for example, the position of gay people in society was once regarded with a great deal of horror and outrage and opposition, but ethical reflection on that moral view changed that moral view, and now we have a much more humane and sensible and accepting attitude, which is a good thing, and that is the result, of course, of ethical views. I think Sam Harris's view might one might express it perhaps better this way, which is to say that reason, the application of reason, and the knowledge that we've accumulated about human nature and the human condition, about human desires and interests and needs, through the great conversation of humankind that is embodied in literature and history and in philosophical reflection, that is what provides us with a very deep and substantial resource for thinking about ethics. And it is that reflection, it is that conversation that we have with ourselves and with one another about the right and the good, about the best kind of society, and about what really matters in individual human lives, that helps us to developing an ethics of generosity and of sympathy and of kindness towards one another, which is based purely on this power that we have, the power of reason and the power of imagination, which enables us to understand how things are for somebody else whose lives we don't share necessarily.
Now, for the religious individual who might hear you and say, well, it sounds to me sort of like a semantic argument, which is that while we can objectively determine what is ethical based on our ability to reason, couldn't our ability to reason or the way in which we reason also sort of evolve or change? And then does it not become just as subjective as saying, oh, religion A says X, Y, and Z about what is ethical? In other words, isn't there the same amount of subjectivity in our ability to reason?
I don't think so. I think there is a great deal of intersubjectivity. That's to say, we learn from one another, we confront one another, we challenge one another, we debate these matters, and we find that there is a great deal, in fact, of agreement and sympathy within groups about how we should comport ourselves. There can sometimes be major differences between groups, of course, that's perfectly true. But this is something which the long unfolding story of history teaches us a valuable lesson about, which is that as time goes by, so I think our societies and our individual moralities do incrementally, inch by inch, sometimes with a step or two backwards for every couple of steps forward, does seem to make progress. For example, I'm very, very impressed indeed by Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which you may remember,
yes.
Shows us that, in fact, societies do seem, slowly and over time, but to be growing really rather much better in these respects. And I would certainly mark this progress by saying the following. Very, very occasionally people say, wouldn't you like to live in some other part of history? And I say, well, yeah, if I could take my dentist with me, certainly I'd like to. It'd be very interesting times in the past to be an observer of. But I wouldn't like to live anywhere other than the modern West and today if I were a woman. So I think that is a marker of just how much progress there has been over history. And this is ethical progress.
I would be interested to hear you talk a little bit about the influence that you believe organized religion has had on society. And you've talked about factors in your writing, which I've read, factors and influences that historically have divided and united human beings. And before we sort of dig into a more specific discussion of this, when you think back over human history, and this is, I think, a good segue given your discussion about living in the modern West as sort of the preferred choice for you currently, what factors have been the biggest dividing factors for humans during observable history, and what factors have been uniting for human beings?
Well, there is a kind of watershed in human affairs, in at least the history of the West, which is that prior to the late 4th century of the Common Era, and in fact, one could even attach a date to it, which is the year 380 of the Common Era, which is when the Edict of Thessalonica was issued, making the Christian religion the only permissible religion in the Roman Empire. That prior to that time, the Roman Empire was very syncretistic. It allowed many, many different religions to flourish. There were many different ethnicities, languages, and traditions within the Roman Empire, which for its time was vast. And so religious practice there was a rather different thing from what we think of it now. For example, the word itself, religio, religere in Latin, means to bind or to bring together. And so the idea was that in the great public festivals of worship of the emperor, as it might be, or of the imperial pantheon, the society was being brought together as a single cohesive whole. But what Christianity borrowed from the mystery religions, which were very much a kind of minority cult beforehand, was this idea of a much more personal relationship, a much more powerful imperial deity requiring something of the individual. And so the idea of religion and religious practice very much changed. And with that change came not the binding together and the bringing together of an empire, but divisions. The first divisions, of course, within Christianity itself, regarding the heretics and the different and sometimes quite powerfully different movements within Christianity, until an orthodoxy was arrived at briefly for a couple of centuries. Then, of course, there was the great schism between Rome and the Orthodox communions. Then there was the Reformation and so on. And unfortunately, with also the outgrowth of Islam, the tensions between the different groups within Christianity and between Christianity and Islam has resulted in a very, very long period indeed of confrontation, religious wars, persecutions because of differences of opinion and the like. And that, I'm afraid, has been a continuing running sore, a cancer, if you like, on history ever since the late 4th century. Now, I don't want for a moment to deny that there have been plenty of good things that have come out of religion, accidentally and directly. Accidentally, I think great architecture and art. After all, artists had to live, and the church had a lot of commissioning power. So as a result, we have some wonderful works of art, paintings, music, and the like, great architecture. But I think on balance, and by a considerable margin, the result of this change in the nature of religion in about the 4th century has been a divisive and a destructive one.
Now, if you were to speak to the adherents either of Islam or any particular Christian sect, some of them, as they have told me, would likely tell you, well, it might appear as though our religion or our sect within our religion has been divisive in terms of its influence, but if only everyone just followed our version of our religion, all of that divisiveness would go away. What's the best retort to that? Is it the pragmatic retort that that's just never going to happen, so we shouldn't even think of it, it's just a utopian fantasy? Or is there a different way we can respond to that, that, hey, the divisiveness comes from all of the other sects, not from ours?
Well, of course, this is one of those happy situations where both sides of that conversation just reported are right. I mean, if everybody agreed with that particular sect, then indeed there would be no conflict. Although human nature being what it is, I'm pretty sure some cause of dissension or disagreement might arise, because we are, after all, a disputatious species. But you also are right. I mean, the fact is that it's extremely unlikely that the different sects will ever agree. I mean, if you look at the history, and we have a rather amusing example here in our own islands in Britain, of the Scottish Church, which is split and split again and split again into ever smaller fragments and breakaway groups. So we have the Free Church, and then we have what are known as the Wee Frees, wee being a Scottish word for small, and then there are the Wee Frees, the small Frees, who broke away from the small Frees,
right,
and so on. So I mean, I do think that that wonderful Monty Python film, The Life of Brian, really does sum it up.
We've been speaking with Professor C Grayling, Professor of Philosophy and Master of New College of the Humanities in London. It's really so great to speak to you, and I'd love to have you back absolutely anytime.
Great pleasure to be on your show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Yesterday, I told you about the disastrous water crisis in Flint, Michigan. Republican Governor Rick Snyder there and his subordinates have declared a state of emergency after lead just filling up that Flint River water that is now being used as the water source in Flint, Michigan, an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease, corruption, etc. That's still going on, but we are in another U.S. city now having a lead in the water crisis. This one is in Ohio. It's been 2 months since the Ohio EPA first identified these high levels of lead in Sebring, Ohio's public water system. And despite the EPA's requirements that the public must be informed by the end of November, Sebring residents were only told of the contamination last week. And the EPA director from Ohio said, quote, "It has become apparent that our field office was too patient in dealing with the village of Sebring's cat and mouse game and should have had closer scrutiny on the water system meeting its deadlines." And yesterday, the state ordered the suspension of Sebring Water Superintendent James Bates, and this is just all an absolute disaster. There has now been a proper alert of heightened lead levels. Schools have been and will remain closed for the time being. Why is this happening, Lewis? Why are we seeing this happen time and again? And it seems to happen in red states, and it seems to happen, not surprisingly, in many more industrial type Rust Belt areas.
Well, the idea maybe is to let the free market decide, deregulation, things like that. I think no oversight, of course. I don't know, Dave. Ultimately, I don't know what is the factor that unites all of these stories. How does this happen? Can't really say with certitude.
Lack of oversight combined with deregulation, combined with so-called free market Republican politics. I mean, we're talking about Ohio and West Virginia and North Carolina and Michigan, as we've been talking about. Republicans react and say, oh, we have to get rid of oversight on just about everything. Just imagine what we would find in this country right now that is harming people's health if we did the oversight we were even supposed to do. Forget about adding oversight. What if the EPA was just properly funded and empowered? Imagine what's going on right now that we have no idea about.
Yeah. Through no fault of your own, you could be living somewhere where the food you eat, the water you drink, and the air you breathe are all poisonous. And that's not the world I want to live in, Dave. But
if you accidentally had a kid and things worked out and you loved the kid, you would not want the kid dealing with the dirty water and the dirty air and the pollution.
No lead in my kid's water. That's my rule.
Remember that supposed Planned Parenthood scandal where it was alleged that Planned Parenthood officials were caught on video selling baby parts? It's bogus, but Republican candidates, including Carly Fiorina, continued to tout the videos as authentic, even way after we knew something was clearly very, very wrong with those videos. And now the case went to a grand jury in Texas, which has reviewed the evidence, and they've decided not to charge any of the officials from Planned Parenthood. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. They are going to be indicting the two anti-abortion activists who secretly filmed the Planned Parenthood people. The jurors indicted David DeLayden and Sandra Merritt for tampering with a government record. DeLayden was also indicted on a separate charge of prohibition of the purchase and sale of human organs. Planned Parenthood said in a letter to lawmakers that DeLayden secretly recorded both staff and patients for more than 60 times, in more than 60 instances over the last 8 years, using fake aliases and fake government ID cards, creating a fake company to gain access to facilities and medical conferences. And similar accusations were made against Planned Parenthood at the national level. Those have also been completely debunked. Lewis, this Planned Parenthood so-called scandal has completely blown up in the faces of these right-wing activists.
It has. I hope that this receives as much attention as those original videos.
Well, I was going to say, I would not be at all surprised if right-wingers keep talking about these videos. Now at least we can respond and say, you mean the videos where the filmmakers were indicted and that no wrongdoing was found in? I mean, it is a win for the good guys, but it's a small one because everyone sees the story and no one sees the correction. Imagine if everyone who ran the initial Planned Parenthood scandal story now ran this story. Of course, we're not going to see that.
Yeah. I mean, the media storm happened. The damage is done. Unfortunately for Planned Parenthood, I don't think this is going to have a huge impact.
In terms
of how the public views them.
Right. And Planned Parenthood, as we've talked about, controversial. Why? We don't really know why Planned Parenthood is controversial. 97% of what they do is not abortion-related services. The 3% that is also should not be controversial. Abortion is a legal medical procedure that is completely uncontroversial, a matter between patient and doctor. In most of the developed world, our friends in the most developed countries. And here it's a really big controversy. It's a religious controversy. It's a political controversy. And these types of stories, bogus stories with these absolutely bogus claims, push this to continue being a controversy that should not exist.
Successful propaganda campaigns. What can you do about that? It still works.
All right. I have a voicemail to play for you that is very, very interesting. The number to our voicemail is 219-2-DAVID-P. A couple of weeks ago, I read this list of demands or requests that Yokol Haram, the armed guys in Oregon occupying a federal building, had. And on that list was tampons. And we said, it's all men. Why do they need tampons? A caller last week said, I know why they need tampons, because they need to plug bullet holes with tampons, and it actually works. we sort of laughed about it. We weren't really sure if it was a joke or not. An Army medic has now called in with insight about this. Let's take a listen.
Hey, David, this is Steve Smith. I'm a former Army medic, and I wanted to comment on the tampon thing.
Yeah.
That's actually true. It is an excellent emergency short-term thing that will work in wounds and they use it in broken noses a lot. But it's not BS. It's absolutely true. Like your show. Thanks.
All right. So I think, Lewis, we have gotten to the bottom of that story. The tampons can be used temporarily to plug bullet holes. Maybe that is why Yoko Haram wanted them.
I guess it could be. Maybe I think there are some women there too, but it works both ways. So that's great.
On today's bonus show, a dog accidentally runs a half marathon and ends up coming in 7th. We'll talk about a Japanese hotel run by the same family for 52 generations. We will also talk about tonight's town hall. We'll talk about some other things that we're looking to do. DavidPakman.com/membership. That is the one way to get access to the bonus show. And I will remind you, all of our members, tonight, 8 p.m. Eastern, we have the David Pakman Show members only town hall. I will be there. Lewis will be there. We will take questions. All questions on the table starting at 8 p.m. Eastern. Sign up because you do not want to miss that. Lewis expected to make some shocking revelations. Now, I don't know if that's true. I mean, if asked, I'm sure Lewis would reveal stuff, but I don't know of any specific revelations he plans to make yet. See you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.